Welcome to Paradigm Shifts with your host, Keisha Kruger. As an organization development practitioner and executive coach, I work with leaders to create positive changes in the workplace using behavioral science. And here, we're on a mission to rethink the way we work, lead, and ultimately live. So, let's unpack light bulb moments for paradigm shifts within your workplace and beyond. Are you ready for a shift? Let's dive in. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Paradigm Shifts podcast. I am thrilled to have with us Nelly Wartoft, who is a Swedish technology entrepreneur and the brilliant mind behind Tiger Hall. Nelly has dedicated her career to transforming how organizations approach change, helping global Fortune 500 companies navigate the complexities of transformation at scale. And her insights come not only from leading Tiger Hall, but also from her hands-on experience in enterprise sales, where she first saw the pitfalls of traditional change communication. Beyond her professional communications or professional accomplishments, Nelly's journey is as dynamic as her leadership. She's been named a Gen T Leader of Tomorrow, excelled as a Swedish national skeet shooting champion, which is really exciting. And today we're going to explore change through three distinct lenses: the executive making the call, the manager executing it, and the individuals experiencing it. So Nelly, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
Well, let's start at the top. When change is on the horizon, let's say at the executive level, there's often this big gap between intention and impact. So I'm curious, from your experience, what's a hard truth that most leaders overlook, even when the data is staring them in their face?
I think the hard truth is that there is a very, very big activation gap when it comes to change, and exactly what you mentioned, the difference between intention and impact. There's some really good research from Gartner around this, just looking at the last 10 years and looking at how many changes impacts the average employee per year. And 10 years ago in 2014, that was one. So you had one change a year, and that's what this is just 10 years ago, right? It feels like that must have been 30 years ago, but it's only 10. And when you had one change per employee per year, the employee support for that change was over 80%, like 82, 83%. And that's something that has then drastically changed to 10 years later in 2024. So right now, the average employee is going through about 14 changes a year. So from 1 to 14. So it's more than once a month. There is something new hitting them, and there is another executive coming in, making another change, and there's a new system, and there's a new restructuring and things going on, right? So from 1 to 14 has meant that change fatigue has increased drastically, and people are just sick and tired of these changes, right? Because most of the time, they're not properly communicated or activated at scale. So right now, the employee average support for change is around 33%. So it's gone from over 80 to 33. So you have this, if you layer those two on top of each other, right, you can see that change activity has gone from 1 to 14, and then support has gone from 83 to 33. And then that leaves us with a very big gap between the number of changes that are happening and the support in organizations for those changes. So that's what is called the change activation gap. And there's a lot of interesting research around that. And the number of changes are only going to continue to increase, right? So I think that's the data that is staring leaders in the face. You need to change more and more, and it's going to be more and more rapidly. It's going to be more frequent. Like this 14 number might be 24 changes a year in 10 years. That could very well be the case. And is your activation support then going to be 0%? Like no one is behind you, no one wants to support the change? That's very real data that is looking leaders in the face right now, that I think they need to think hard about how they manage to be successful in driving change and transformation.
That research is absolutely fascinating. And while you are sharing that data, the thing that came to mind was, like, to your point, are we ever going to decrease the level of change, the pace of change? And the answer is probably no. So what do we do to support and bring additional support to those changes? Is it just becoming more change agile, more change ready as individuals? Is it adapting and just expecting that change? Like, what are the things that executives can do to help close that change activation gap?
Yeah, so there are a few things that people are talking about. There is one philosophy of doing less change and doing fewer, less frequent, having just more stability, which I think is a very unrealistic scenario. So I don't think that's going to happen. But there is still that school of thought that let's just do less and let's prioritize better. So that's something people talk about. How can we prioritize better? How can we select fewer initiatives and have those done better rather than having all of these changes happening simultaneously? I think that's going to be really hard, though, because technology is not going to slow down. And especially with AI and all the advancements in that area, it's going to be faster and faster. And the impact is going to speed up. So companies kind of have a choice to either keep up and keep changing or fall behind. And executives are never going to make the choice to let's fall behind. So that means that change is never going to decrease, right? So I think the option to prioritize better and do less is not so realistic. It's a good intention, but I don't think executives are going to be able to be held accountable to that. I think a better way of doing it is managing better and activating better. So change activation is a huge piece in this, right? And how you activate it across the org and how you drive everything from the way that you communicate, how you communicate the changes, what you communicate to who, at what time, how do you personalize it, segment it, make sure that people only experience what they should experience. Because another big issue, right, is that if you're having these 14 changes, that means that the organization might be going through, say, like 20 and you experience 14. But like, do you have to experience those 14, and out of those 14 do you have to experience all of the things happening in those 14, or can you only focus on what's relevant for you? So I think the relevancy, and if we think of, say, like social media, right, like how we are just fed what we are, like what's interesting for us and what's more personalized to us, that's how we need to start thinking in change activation as well. So making sure that people receive only what they should, that we don't overwhelm them with unnecessary information. Even if they're experiencing a part of that change, do they really need to know everything and see everything? So this one size fits none, where you send the same message to everyone and everyone receives the same 300 emails a day. And then you put it on the employee to sort through, is this for me? Is this not for me? And people just see 3 emails that are not for them. And they go, okay, this is not relevant for me. And they ignore all the rest of the 300. So relevance, personalization, timely communication, and just being better with the intentions around it. That's one big piece in the activation puzzle that I think more organizations need to get right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that is a fantastic perspective, because at the end of the day, sifting through all that information just takes a lot of energy, as we see with social media, with just the number of emails that we get inundated with on an everyday basis. But when I am managing change at our organization, oftentimes the leaders resist, like, well, if we're going to create this comprehensive change management communication plan, and it's, let's say, tailored and segmented out for different groups of impacted individuals, is it more work on the back end? And it's a sacrifice up front, but it sounds like it's better for the end user. And what's the ultimate goal? Is it getting people to adopt and move along that change curve? Or is it making it easier on the back end, right?
Yeah, and you can do both. I mean, that's Tiger Hall, the business that I run, is built for that, right? It's built to make that automated and easy and scalable, because doing it manually, to your point, is hard and it's a lot of work. So you need technology for it, and there are technologies out there that support with that.
That's amazing. I'd love to hear more about Tiger Hall and how you support change automation. Can you share with us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. So the way that Tiger Hall works for change leaders is that it automates all of those things that we spoke about. So you have, first of all, you have a very differentiated content format experience for the employees. So instead of sending out mass emails and producing tons of PowerPoint decks and PDFs and these kind of formats that people aren't really resonating with, Tiger Hall is all about short videos, micro podcasts. Like, this format is something people resonate with, and it's short, bite-sized, engaging. So it breaks through the noise of all of this PDF chaos and SharePoint mess and email inboxes that people are just tired of managing. So that's the first step, is how do you create differentiated content? And there are a few ways of doing that, both through, like, you can upload a PDF and people can listen to it as a podcast, for example. And you can also create a quick video on your phone, upload it, and people can consume it. So people can choose across the formats. Do I want to listen to it? Do I want to read it? Do I want to watch it? So it's their choice if they're a reader, listener, or anything else. And then also in their local language. So they can, if you've uploaded an English PDF, I can listen to it in French, for example, if that's my preference.
Amazing.
So that already takes that personalization and kind of like we hear you one step further, because there is nothing worse than being an employee, say, outside of the US and the US headquarters and all of this English communication that feels like you didn't even consider that I grew up not speaking English at all.
Yeah.
It's nothing less inclusive. So that's the first step. And then after that, you have audience segmentation and ensuring that people only get what they are supposed to get. So it's looking at a mix of different data sources, and this is where you can use anything from your HRIS to your CRM, ERP, or even an Excel sheet, and just use dynamic audiences so people get what they should be getting at that point. And that's also automatically updated. So if you say everyone who reports to our Canada president 3 levels down is in the sales organization and has been with the company for more than 3 years, for example, if that's your audience, then they get that communication. And then if someone suddenly has been with the organization for more than 3 years or moves to Canada or starts reporting to this person, everything is automated. So now they get all of this communication information too. And then it's all integrated in the flow of work. So it arrives in your Microsoft Teams or whichever tool you're using at the right time, like a chatbot. And then you have two-way feedback loops. And this is the most critical part, is to give people a voice. That's the number one thing you can do in change activation, is making sure that people feel like they have a voice and that they have a say. So what Tigerroll incorporates are those two-way feedback loops, so people can share their feedback, they can ask any follow-up questions they might have, anything they don't understand, and have that directly where they consume the knowledge. So it's not like, oh, if you have any questions, send us this email and we'll respond to you in 30 days. Which is usually how people do it, if they even have an inbox like that at all. And then when you do that, you have to then go in and reply people individually, which in Tigerroll, you can see which groups have which questions and how are they responding. And then you can go back and target them with a message addressing their concerns. So you can be extremely specific in how you target people based on that social sentiment analysis and follow-up questions. So the feedback loops are very critical. And then the last part is all the data that you get out of it. So that's one aspect of the data that you get that allows you to target better, but you also get data around like how are people reacting, thinking, feeling, what are they consuming, who's your change champions, and who are the influential people in the organization. So there's a ton of data that you get with it as well that allows you to do change activation a lot better than you have in the past.
Now, Nelly, I don't know if anyone listening is going to believe this or not, but you and I have not talked about this tool prior to this episode. And I'm sitting here as a change management practitioner thinking this is the future of change management. I mean, this tool is literally what every change practitioner wants. And I would love to learn more about it. This is incredible. And I can't wait to share this information with all the listeners in the show notes. But thank you for sharing a little bit more about the tool and the platform, and absolutely agree on the two-way feedback loops. Closing that loop is so critical. And it's fascinating how, these hard truths around change can ripple through an entire organization. We were really just talking about at the executive level, but I would love for us to kind of bring it down to the people that are tasked with translating this big picture change or these big picture decisions into action. And those are our middle managers. They're often the ones that are caught in the middle, and they're balancing executive vision with team execution. And from what you've seen, I'm curious, what's one thing that they should stop doing to avoid burnout, and what's something that they should focus on more to drive success?
Yeah, I was one of those middle managers in a large global organization. So that's the inspiration behind Tigerroll, is seeing firsthand how hard that was and how difficult it was to get right with people on the ground. And that's what inspired me to start the company, because I thought, instead of all these mass emails and SharePoint and not asking people what they think, no two-way feedback loops, I think there are things we can do better here. But I think as middle managers, and there's nothing that is like super easy for middle managers to do. And I do think middle management is the hardest part in the organization, because you're constantly sandwiched between the executives and the front line. And there is no way of pleasing everyone. So you constantly have to take the hit for both sides and have to be like, if you're executives are not great, then you have to just take that and pretend everything is great. And then vice versa, if your team is not performing, you have to take the hit for that, right? So I do think middle management is a very tough role. One thing I would recommend to what you mentioned about minimize burnout and something they should double down on, I do think that middle managers can put a little bit more pressure on their leaders above to clarify and be more clear in change. And I know this is super hard, and many times those leaders even don't have the information. And there are so many times where, say, a regional head would find out about news the same time as people in that region. And then that regional head wouldn't have the information. And that's on the company. That's on the change management and the top leaders, right? Because that shouldn't happen, because that's just a terrible experience for everyone involved. But say that they maybe do have some more information. I think middle managers can put some more pressure on leaders to clarify, but before they have to take it to the front line, and to demand that the relevant communication, right? That's another thing that we see, like when you time communications based on like stage and seniority. So maybe you involve your middle managers much earlier and have them receive specific messaging, and also then enable them with like, this is the messaging you can take to your team. And then cascading it like that. So you don't have everyone receiving the news about a merger at the same time. Like maybe you involve people at different stages and time the communications in that way, because that would make middle managers feel more valued and feel like they are a manager and that they are more senior, that they get that special attention. And it would also help with clarity and communications further down the line. There was someone I spoke with that compared like leadership alignment to geometry, which I thought was a pretty helpful analogy. And just like in geometry, if you're a little bit misaligned at the top, the misalignment at the bottom is going to be massive. So you need to be just 100% aligned at the top for it to not cascade down and be super misaligned all the way down, right? So that's just how geometry works, and that's how this works as well. So if there's anything that middle managers can do, it would probably be pushing back, clarify upwards, and put some pressure on their leaders to make sure that, are we receiving what we should be receiving? Is this something that is for us? Is it relevant? Or are you just sending the same things to everyone? Like, tell me what I need to know and what I need to know from my team, not just send me the whole gamut because you are lazy.
Absolutely. And I think what's really valuable about what you said from that perspective is that number one, timing is so critical on this, in the timing of the communication, the delivery of the communication, but also bringing in middle managers a little bit earlier in advance of the rest of their teams is a key, because you get to double down on the feedback of potential blind spots or resistance that you might face, because when they do come up and clarify upwards, they could provide some of those additional suggestions that maybe the executive leadership didn't think about or didn't think to include. And that does help kind of provide more iteration to the change overall before it does get to the masses in a way. So I think that's really valuable. Also, because managers find themselves in a position where they're kind of expected to embody change and also stay resilient themselves. What about themselves, like experiencing the change, like at the same time, they don't get a chance or the space to kind of sit with the change. They're expected to kind of execute without necessarily being able to process. And so I'm curious what your experience has been with that.
Yeah, and that's always the hard part, right? You have to get behind something that you didn't decide, and you have to pretend like you are behind it and that you are supporting it, even if you may not be. I think that's hard. That's really emotionally and psychologically hard. I think part of how you can handle it is, I usually talk about identity, and how you view yourself and how you talk to yourself and how you view your identity can help with some of this. If you base your identity on things like resilience and adaptability and learning and always open to new opportunities, those kind of identity self-identifiers, if you will, they will help you get through it, as opposed to if you view yourself as, I am this head of marketing, for example, and this is my title and this is what I do, and like those things that can change all the time. So the less your identity is tied to things that can change, the more resilient you are in the face of change usually. So that's something that they can think of. And also like seeing opportunity. Like I know so many middle managers in large enterprises that I've seen that we work with, for example, that are super just excited about change, and wherever the change is, they see opportunity and they know it can lead to something good, and it's just like complete like mindset. And then you see the ones on the other side that regardless of what the change is, they think it's bad. So even if the change is we're going to give everyone a bonus, they think it's bad. Like it's almost at that level. So I do think a lot of it comes down to personality and mindsets. And I think that it's the way that you identify and the way you see yourself. Because the ones that are those gung-ho, love change, like bring me something new, are usually the ones that thrive on adventure and new experiences, and they see opportunity in those things. So yeah, like if you anchor yourself to things that aren't changing, like your internal resilience and learning mindset and growth mindset, you'll be able to handle it a lot better.
You're just dropping all the gems for those who want to stay resilient in the face of change. Identify with something internal, not external. That's amazing. So employees on the ground who are feeling the impact of change, what does the data tell us that they're really craving from leadership, but might not be expressing outright? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Humanity is literally the number one thing. It's things like transparency, it's realness, it's authenticity, it's don't fucking lie to me. Sorry, my expression. But it's that's the kind of thinking they have that they might not always express. It's just like, treat us as the adults we are. We understand that there is no such thing as a win-win-win transformation usually. Those win-win transformations exist much more in PR departments than they exist in the real world. And there is nothing worse than CEOs going out and saying, we're going to change the world, we're going to make it better for customers, we're going to save the environment, this and that, when in reality, all they're chasing is those extra percentage operating margin points on Wall Street, right? And I'm like, it's fine. Like, it's fine to chase something for Wall Street. I get that you need to deliver your EBITDA and your percentage margins and your earnings per share. And like, I get that you need to deliver that. But just tell us that. Just be honest about it, right? Like, we understand that you're a capitalistic enterprise and there is a good need for those in the world. And a lot of innovation and products that we love are coming from these enterprises. And we get that you have to make money and that you have to deliver shareholder value. So just be real about it. Just be transparent. Don't tell us about this saving the environment bullshit if that's not what your intention is. That is the biggest thing that people are craving, is just be real with me. Tell me what's going on. Give me transparency and trust that I can handle the truth. Because people feel patronized when you're not telling them the truth. They feel like, you don't trust me. You don't think I can handle the truth. You don't think I understand how business works. Of course, I understand there might be layoffs and my job might be impacted and this and that, but just be real with me about it. So if there's one thing that employees crave, it's just transparency and trust and realness. And that still seems to be the hardest thing for leaders to give them, which is annoying, but it still seems so far for most leaders to get to that. And that's the biggest thing they can do to make a difference and make this successful.
Yeah, it seems so common sense, but at the end of the day, we're not seeing it in action and in the reality. So what do you think is holding leaders back from rallying around what's real, and instead of sugarcoating or trying to rally around some, compelling story to get people to buy into change, which humans see through. They see through. And to your point, why don't you trust me is, maybe a first thought when an employee gets a message like that. Or what are you hiding is another skepticism, a form of skepticism that I've seen. Why are you making this so convoluted to the point where you're almost assuming I have no idea what's going on? Like, there's something that you're hiding. Like, people get those instincts, right? So what do you think is holding leaders back from just giving it to people real?
Yeah, especially that, like, what are you hiding? That's such a good addition. It's something that people think all the time. What are you hiding from me? Like, what is your real agenda here? And then when you're not saying the agenda, like the real agenda, then people start making it up themselves, right? They make up their own stories, and then that starts to be the rumor circulating in the organization. So, and then you can't stop it from there. I think what's holding leaders back is fear. I see so much fear in senior leaders, and fear of, I think part of it is the whole, cancel culture and all of that makes a little bit part of it. I think leaders see how others are sometimes being treated when things go wrong, and then they mistake that for being transparent. So they think that being transparent will lead to cancel culture, but actually when you look at who has been cancelled, it's not people have been transparent, it's for other reasons. But that misunderstanding is something that I hear still. And then I also think it's a little bit of a generational shift that is going on. And there's some interesting studies around looking at CEOs in corporate America in the 50s, 60s. It was around 60-65% that had a military background. So that was by far the most common CEO background was coming from the military. In the early 20s, that was down to like 2%. So it's much, much less leaders now coming from that military space. But how corporations are built and like the corporate language and business in general, a lot of it is actually based on military terms. And if you think of like words we use, like we have a mission and like it's a lot of like those kind of terminology as well. So it is a bit military inspired. And in the military, you get rewarded for being strong and putting on a brave face and not being weak and vulnerable, right? So I think it's a little bit of a hangover from the military, frankly, that could also be spooking, and people have grown up in that generation. Like most CEOs are between like, say, 50 to 65 in large Fortune 500 firms. And when they grew up, they weren't encouraged to, most of them weren't encouraged to be vulnerable and show like quote unquote weakness. They were rewarded for other things. And the way that they got to their CEO position might have been by doing these things. And then that's a very, very hard behavior to unlearn. And I was speaking to one organization that had this challenge in leadership because their CEO had gotten, this was a female CEO in a very, very male-dominated industry. And she had gotten to that CEO position by elbows and being strong and always having a strong face and putting on a strong front and so on. So now that her entire organization now demanded more vulnerable leadership, more transparency, more authenticity, she just couldn't provide it because everything that was the way that she was taught and how she had grown into that role was by not being that. Mm-hmm. So that's another reason, I think. It's not an excuse, but it's still a reason, and it's an understandable reason. Like the self-reinforcement of what makes us successful is so strong. And if your behavior to become successful is A, you're not suddenly going to shift that to becoming B. And it's going to be really, really psychologically hard for you to do that. So I think that's another reason leaders are finding it so hard.
Yeah, fear is such a big driver of a lot of decisions or behaviors in general. I think that's a really important point that you make here, and that leaders being aware of what's driving that fear or being aware of that fear that's driving those behaviors is so important and absolutely requires some level of self-awareness. I agree also, like getting promoted up through the organization into a hierarchy type of an organization, the reinforcement of, having to kind of elbow your way through or be strong. It's like what gets you there isn't always going to be sustainable at the end of the day, because what's required is that ability to adapt and provide, that adaptive leadership style that provides what's needed at the time of that crisis or in the business. So unspoken needs can be a little tricky to navigate, and addressing them seems to make all the difference. And speaking of impact, communication does play such a critical role in how change is received at every level. And so from your experiencing, is there a small but impactful shift that leaders can make in how they communicate change that almost guarantees better buy-in? Like, what do you think is often missing in that first rollout?
So changing their entire communication style is maybe a little bit of a big step, and I know many people might not be able to do that. It would still be the best if they can, and they can embrace that authenticity and the transparency and the realness. That would be the biggest win. If they find themselves unable to do that, there are still small things that you can do. And looking at data, for example, like just virtual backgrounds is one of those that decrease trust, because people are like, what are you hiding?
Sure.
And that's just having a virtual background in a Zoom or Teams call, right? So there are some of these simple things that automatically decrease or increase trust. So that's a tiny thing. Then the same with the format, like podcast, for example, has very high trust levels because it's much more nuanced. You have voices. People feel like they're a fly on the wall. You get much more out of a podcast than you do out of a, say, PDF document. So that's something that the data shows. Exactly. And you feel closer to the person. Like when someone is listening to us two now, then they would feel like they're in the room, that they're part of the conversation. Whereas if we would have sent them the same information in a PDF, they wouldn't feel the same connection to us. So you can also do, even if your underlying communication style doesn't change, you can still experiment with formats. So podcast is good. Also videos, like just like raw, real, authentic, like not having it overly produced. This is another issue that I'm seeing. I see companies investing so much time in really high quality professional content production and actually looking at the data, because like on Tigerol, we have both, right? And depending on what the organizations do, and the things that perform much better are the less produced. So literally just like picking up your phone, recording a short message, like, because it shows humanity. And especially if you record that while being in a little bit more casual clothes at home, you know, showing more of you and who you are. So if you still want to be or struggle to get out of that like stiffer communication style, just experiment with the environment you're in, the clothes you're wearing, the formats you share it in. Those tiny things will start making a difference. And that will hopefully also then put you in a comfortable position to be a little bit more vulnerable and transparent when you are more personal. But people want to know who you are, and they want to see you as a human being, not as this corporate executive name that they cannot identify with that pops up in their email inbox once in a while. So the closer you can get to people, so audio, watching, formats, those things make a big difference as well, and are usually easier to do than just completely do a 180 on how you speak.
Yeah, that's such a practical takeaway. So much of how change is embraced depends on how it's communicated and delivered. There's an individual that I follow. She's an HR global leader on Instagram, and she actually recently posted about this, that she recently shared a video of her with, you know, bad angles and hormonal acne, and just like it was a draft that she was just trying to create for a message she wanted to deliver. And she wasn't going to, this is Hack Your HR, I don't know if you follow her, but she wasn't going to put it out. She asked her brother for feedback, and her brother was like, no, put that out like that. And she's like, well, I didn't do my makeup. I didn't have all this stuff. And he was like, so what? Like, that's real. That's raw. That's authentic. And then she ended up following up with her followers, sharing, like, she got the most views, like 2 million views from this video, and it was just skyrocketing. And she's like, really, all I had to do this entire time was be authentic and not, you know, overproduce my video. I just think that's such a valuable takeaway, going from years ago, wasn't that long ago, where filters was the thing, right? And now it's like unfiltered is the trend in a lot of ways. And that I think applies in the corporate and workforce world as well.
Yeah, 100%. And that's also the reason TikTok has grown so much over Instagram, right? Like, why did TikTok how did TikTok become what it became when you already had Instagram? Because Instagram is polished, it's very filtered, and then on TikTok people got this raw realness. So you have a very clear example there as well.
I love that. So I want to zoom out for a moment, think about the broader lessons, because we've gone from the executive perspective, the manager perspective, the employee perspective. We talked about change and communication in general. So if you had to give one piece of advice to C-suite leaders about how to approach change with a human-first mindset, what would that be? And how would you make sure they actually hear it and act on it?
So beyond everything that was said around communication style and authenticity, I think one other thing that leaders should be a lot better at is not taking change resistance personally. That's something that would help them. Because so many leaders feel, as we all do, everything is about me. And this change resistance, they question me as a leader. They don't like this initiative. Like, people take it so personally. And I think it would help leaders to understand that change resistance is not personal to you. It's a very natural human reaction that everyone is going through. And I have a very interesting episode on this actually in my podcast, The Only Constant, which is where I interview change leaders. And there's a guy I interviewed that did a research study, PhD level on this. And he speaks about how even the ones that are the most agile and adaptable to change, even they are going through these emotions of the normal like change resistance curve, right? So even the ones that are champions and positive, they still do that. So it's a very natural human reaction, and we shouldn't expect people to just like pick it up and deal with it, right? And when leaders take this personally and think it's all about them, that doesn't help the leader because they're going to be less open to feedback. And the most important thing that you can do in change is actually, as I mentioned earlier, giving people a voice, make sure you hear their feedback, take their perspective on board. And when you think it's about you, you're naturally going to be much more resistant to that feedback. And that's going to derail your entire initiative. So don't take change resistance personally. It's always there. It's always going to happen. See it as a natural part. And also it's a sign that people care, right? If people are just completely not caring about it, they would just be like, yeah, sure, you do whatever you want. I'm not going to care. But change resistance shows that people have their emotions involved. They do care about their job and where they work. And that's an important part of it. So don't take it personally would be one advice for them.
I love that. And thank you for that reframe, because we absolutely can take those things personally and put up those walls. So that's a really good reframe. Nelly, thank you for walking us through change from all angles: executive decision-making, middle management challenges, and the employee experience, and your insights backed by data, and you brought real world application. It's just so incredibly powerful. Before we wrap up, where can our listeners connect with you or learn more about your work?
So I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so they can follow me and write to me on LinkedIn. So that's Nelly Wartoft. And also feel free to email me. I'm on nelly@tigerhall.com. So that's NELLIE at tigerhall.com. So welcome to reach out.
Thank you again for joining us, Nelly. And to our listeners, if today's episode sparked new ideas for you, don't forget to subscribe and share this conversation. See you next time.